5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're live.
Hey, hi everyone. Welcome back to the Leadership Detectives. Ready for another episode of us giving you some good clues to great leadership. Busy week for us, and we've got a lot of stuff going on, but really good to be able to spend the time here. And I'm really excited about what we're about to do next. But I'm going to let Neil tell you more about that. Okay. Neil, how are you?
I'm fabulous, thanks, mate. And yeah, just we are busy at the moment, and it's great to be doing so many of these leadership podcasts at the moment. But I'm especially pleased about today's podcast, which I'll share with you why in a minute. But it's great to welcome Chris Hunter onto the podcast. Chris, how are you doing?
Very good, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much for having me on.
Okay, and it's great to have you. And what part of the world are you in, just so people know where you are?
I'm in Herefordshire, a little town called Hay-on-Wye, and just returned from Libya, so it's nice to be home.
And I spoke to Chris last week when he was in Libya, and let me just introduce Chris. So Chris is also the first person we've ever had on this podcast who's got a Wikipedia page.
Oh, God, we are moving up in the market. Oh,
so I thought I'd just go on there and just have a look at what it says about Chris on the Wikipedia page. It says, Chris joined the British Army. Actually, it says Hunter, but I've put Chris in. Chris joined the British Army in 1989 as a 16-year-old army apprentice. He trained initially as a Russian linguist working in defence intelligence, and after 4 years enlisted service, was selected to undergo officer training at Sandhurst. He graduated at 21 and was awarded the Carmen Sword of Honour. He was then commissioned to the Royal Logistics Corps. That route would eventually lead to becoming an ATO, or ammunition technical officer, in the bomb disposal unit of the British Army. Served as a troop commander in the Falklands, East Africa, Northern Ireland, and undertook Arctic warfare training in Norway, becoming an EOD operator. As an operator, 2 tours of Northern Ireland, Iraq, and there's loads of other stuff in here as well about Chris protecting the royal family, working with the special forces, working with governments all over the world, and most impressively as well got awarded the Queen's Gallantry Medal, which is not given out to many people. Personally, I'm really excited to have Chris here because for those that know, I was in the Army Reserve and EOD as well, in the Royal Engineer part of the British Army, although I never went to some of the places Chris went to. Chris, it's fab to have you here, and wow, what a CV.
Thank you very much, Neil. Cheers.
If I wasn't feeling insignificant before, I can tell you I probably am now. But I'm sure it's not all roses, Chris. I'm sure we got some. There's something that comes with all of those things you've achieved in life, and I guess we'll hear about them here. So,
go on. That's the first question, Albert.
Well, that was your introduction, right? So it'd be interesting to hear Chris's introduction. So, Chris, imagine that you'd have to imagine it because it happens all the time. You're being introduced on stage, but you can choose who's going to introduce you on stage this time. Who would that be that does that introduction, and what would they say about you?
That's a good one, isn't it? I'd have to think about who it's going to be. But if I'm completely honest with you, I think they'd probably say something along the lines of, he's Forrest Gumped his way through his life and his career. And I've got no idea how he got here. So, yeah, for me, it's very kind, everything you've said there. But it still sounds surreal hearing it. I feel like I'm a normal bloke who's had a pretty normal life, or maybe a slightly unusual life. That's about it, though, yeah.
That's interesting. I'll just kind of go off script a minute after, but that's an interesting comment to make. So, did you plan that journey, or did you stumble into that journey?
Yeah, I did a bit of both. Definitely, I planned to join the military. My dad died when I was quite young, and I'd gone off the rails. I was about 14 or 15, yeah, and gone off the rails. And when he was on his deathbed, we had this conversation, and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm going to join the army, Dad." And he said, "Well, I take it you're going to be an officer." And I was like, "Oh dear, no pressure." And I said, "Well, yeah, of course." And he said, "Take my advice." He gave me a lifeline. He said, "Go and get a trade first, and spend some time as an enlisted soldier. Because if your leadership ability isn't identified anyway, then you'd make a pretty shoddy officer anyway." So he threw me a bit of a lifeline, and I thought I better go and get a trade. So that's why I got into the Royal Signals to start with as a Russian linguist. But I was the worst Russian linguist in the entire history of military intelligence, which is why I went to then Sandhurst and stumbled into bomb disposal. So yeah, it was a bit of each, really. Yeah, I meant to join the military, but the rest of it was very much.
So you stumbled into bomb disposal then? That was the.
Yeah, I mean, I basically.
It's never a good thing, really, is it?
I'd sort of considered it. I mean, like most young soldiers and army officers, I'd had this fantasy about joining the special forces at some point. And I thought of going down the infantry line. But, I saw a demo when I was at Sandhurst, and that kind of, planted the seed. And then when I was in Northern Ireland a couple of years later, actually working with the Royal Engineers as it happened, I saw a couple of car bombs at the headquarters in Northern Ireland. And, it was quite horrendous, obviously. And I know it's going to be very upbeat, so I won't sort of dwell on that. But I saw the guys doing their, the ATOs that you mentioned, going clearing all the cars, because after 2 cars had exploded there, they thought there might be a third. And I was so impressed with these guys. And then I met them in the bar a few weeks later, and just sort of gelled with them. So it was kind of, that was my calling, I guess.
Got it. Okay. All right.
But in that, Chris, I mean, did you always know you wanted to lead in this environment, or were you just keen to be a practitioner in this environment? What was the bigger motivation?
I think it was definitely both. I wanted to be a soldier for sure.
Yeah.
But, I joined the Army Cadets when I was 14 and, got promoted within the cadets quite quickly. When I joined as an Army apprentice, I got promoted as a young junior soldier quite quickly and sort of went through that sort of, rank structure and was identified, as having officer potential, I guess. And I enjoyed leading as well. And I think, as we all know, and anybody that's watching this, when they say leaders are born, not made, I think, you definitely have something that makes you a leader or makes you predisposed towards leadership. And then obviously, that's nurtured, developed, trained, yada, yada, yada.
I don't know how long you've known Neil, but there's actually a story of how Neil's leadership began, which I think was in his shed in the garden when he was about 12. But if he hasn't told you it, he'll tell you at some other time. So,
okay. It's on one of the podcasts for anyone who's interested.
It is on another podcast if you want to.
But it's not about me. So, Chris, with the vast experience you've had over the last, well, I guess if we go back to 30 years of experience of leadership, and this podcast's all about uncovering clues of great leadership, what would you say are some of the key elements of leadership that you've seen or learned over the last 30 years?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think courage is very important. And when I talk about courage, I mean moral and physical courage. The ability to do what's right, to overcome, your own sort of personal fears, especially. Courage isn't about being, fearless. It's about, knowing and identifying fear, being scared, and doing it anyway. And I think that's really, really important. I think knowledge is really important, and certainly the continual pursuit of knowledge and learning. I think people always talk about honesty and integrity. Of course, that's important. You've got to be able to trust those people that are in charge and that are leading you. And, even if that person isn't necessarily, a naturally charismatic leader, you need to know what makes them tick. You need to know where you stand with them, don't you? I think that's really, really important too. In my own experience, I think decisiveness is really important. It's very, very difficult when especially when the pressure's on and you've got to make a decision. You can't get all the information, or your competitors are, also in that observation, the OODA loop, the decision action cycle. Yeah. You've got to make a decision quickly. I think that's really, really important. Emotional intelligence. I think that's really, really important nowadays. You've got to be able to understand people. It's not just about barking orders. Judgment, humility, and communication, definitely. Communication to me is really, really important. I think it's the one thing I've seen continually through my time as a soldier, as a leader, as someone working with industry as well. Those organizations where communication is effective and clear and concise, they tend to do quite well. where it's bad, they tend to, have some sort of breakdown, I think. And I could talk about communication forever, to be honest with you. I think that's probably the most important of all of them, actually.
It's an interesting way, yeah, because it comes up regularly in these conversations, whichever leader we're talking to or person we're talking to. But how do you do that? How do you communicate well? And in the environment you've been in, what do the good communicators do and what do the bad communicators do?
I'll give you an example from everyday life. Okay, I think when we go on holiday, when we're on the concourse at Paddington Station, whatever station, and the trains are delayed, the planes are delayed. Nobody likes being delayed. Nobody likes the unknown. But people actually are prepared to tolerate it. But when you don't get any information, that's when people start to get annoyed and start to get nutty, and that's when there's a breakdown.
Right.
And I think, it's those sort of times that it's really, really important. And I think as well, we can get really tied up in the moment, especially when we're a leader and when we're in a busy, operational, fluid environments where decisions have got to be made. But sometimes I think you just got to take that check pace, take a breath, have a pause, reflect, and just communicate where you are and maybe even what your intentions are going to be. And just trickle feeding that information, I think, is often enough for people to... and they feel valued as well, I think, when you do that.
Okay, yeah.
And I think it's expected, right? And I think that's what some leaders don't get, is their teams expect them to keep them up to date with what's going on, where they fit in the equation and so on. So look, some great stuff that you've called out there, Chris, right? And courage has always been one that we've had listed on here. Neil, you got something on your mind?
We'll come back to courage, I think, as well, because there's a couple of questions I want to drill into there. But actually, on communication and the military, I think one of the things I find in business that is different to the military, when you go through Sandhurst, you learn about an orders process, don't you? Yeah. You learn about having an O group and then passing the information down and then passing the information down. And it's one of the things I see in business that it doesn't work. Someone will go to a board meeting, gather all this information at the board meeting, and then they go off and get on with their day. Yeah. They don't think about how they're going to communicate downwards. Do you think that's? Do you see that happening in the world you're in now, but also in the world? Did that level of communication all the way down? Was that a secret to good communication?
Yeah, I think certainly the world we live in now, with electronic communication, it's actually a bit easier to pass on information, and the onus will often be on the other employees to actually go and have a look and extract the relevant information from that vast amount of information you refer to there. Interesting when you talk about that military orders process and what they call the combat estimate process. Yeah. The idea, I think one of the really good sort of components of military success is based on that process. And it's the idea that what your boss is trying to achieve and what your part is within his plan, but you also know what his boss in the next level above is trying to achieve. And your part within that plan too. And the idea is that, when a plan goes belly up, as it so often does, if you don't have the necessary resources or the necessary information, at least if you know what your boss is trying to achieve and his boss is trying to achieve, then you can at least do something to influence that for the greater good.
Yeah, and we did a session recently on vision and on a vision stroke mission stroke direction. And they brought that into the military orders in the 90s, was the commander's intent. It wasn't there when I did Sandhurst, actually. It was just coming in. But that commander's intent was really important, so that people knew that if their part of the mission didn't go right, they knew how they might be able to adapt to achieve the commander's intent.
Exactly, yeah.
I was watching some of your videos online, Chris. You've got a lot of stuff up there on YouTube, and if anybody wants to go and watch it, it's very worthwhile to listen to some of the messages Chris has got up there. But one of the things you talked up there about, Chris, is that what's different between what you did and what industry does is you've had the time always to prepare. You've trained for months and months and months. You've got yourself ready. You're good to go. And it's different in industry. They don't always get that chance. So you've got some good examples. And if you combine that with what you've just told us about what you think are good attributes of leadership, have you got some examples of great leadership that you've seen over the years that you've been doing what you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the conflicts that we've been involved in, the Gulf War one, it's difficult when you talk about war and conflict to talk about it, as a success or a failure. It usually results in people's lives being lost, and therefore it's obviously a failure in that respect. But if you look at it purely from a military objective, going into Iraq in the first Gulf War, going into Iraq in the second Gulf War, they made a plan, and that plan was basically enacted, and they effectively defeated Saddam's forces in both environments, both times round. Those were successful military operations, if you like. The leadership was sound. All of those qualities that I talked about were implemented, if you like, and it worked. The Iranian embassy siege back in the 80s, the first time that the British special forces certainly had been involved in such they opened themselves up to the entire world. That planning was the plan was put into place. First of all, they looked at the intelligence picture. They looked at the threats. They looked at all of the factors and deductions that might influence their plan. They came up with 3 options. They were well trained way before the Iranian embassy siege actually took place. And then they built, a full-scale replica of some of the rooms, and certainly a decent replica model of it. And they practiced and trained and rehearsed. So I think that idea, when I talked about knowledge and I talk about practice and training, it does annoy me, actually, when I hear other speakers from the military banging on about how the military does everything better than industry and industry can learn so much from the military. It makes me cringe, and I find it very insulting. But they do have a point. But I think, what you alluded to there, the point is, industry doesn't always have the opportunity to train somebody up for a minimum of 6 months before some sort of tasking, to then continually mentor and reevaluate right the way through the process of the execution of that task, and then effectively have a 6-month lessons learned process after the task is complete. But what industry does have is the ability to, it's got experiential learning. So I think you can certainly capture the lessons learned, and you can certainly pass those lessons on to other people, and have somebody responsible in an organisation for identifying and communicating those lessons to other people. So it is possible to agree.
But I think there's an interesting point here. I would be less sympathetic with business than you're being, actually. I think leaders in business need to make space for rehearsal. Or practicing and role playing. In the sales environment, one of the things we focus on the sales environment is role play, is rehearsing, but there are not enough times made for it. Leaders don't make enough space. They're just too busy trying to. And what happens when you're too busy trying to chase things is then mistakes are made. And the wash-up's really key as well. We've heard this from a number of people. Is that learning experience, again, in business, they don't make enough time for it. And I think there's lessons there for leaders from what you've just said to, make time for rehearsal and role play, and make time for wash-ups and learning reviews.
I think the difference is here is Chris is saying you have to do it in where he is. And we don't have to do it in industry, and they avoid doing it. So it's a great lesson, guys. Just think about how much more effective you could be if you applied the lessons that we just picked up there. Absolutely right.
And I'm going to come back to Albert's question, Vic, so I'm not going to let you off the hook on that one. I wanted to, there was a question, the question he asked was examples of great leadership. And you gave some great macro examples of Schwarzkopf and co. But what about, really real examples that you don't have to give us the exact scenario. I'm more interested in how they were leading you. What was a great example of leadership that you've experienced, or when you thought, actually, I just did a really good job as a leader there?
Well, I'm certainly not going to talk about how I was a great leader. I'll leave you to do that. It always makes me think of the phrase, when you're good, you tell other people. When you're great, other people tell you. But I guess the 7/7 bombings, actually, I was heavily involved in the response to the 7/7 bombings.
Right.
I spent most of my career, as I said to you, I started off in intelligence, training as a Russian linguist. I was useless at it, and then went into the bomb disposal trade for most of my trade. Spent some time with the special forces, but finished up working in intelligence, interestingly. And I was across the road from Downing Street in the old War Office building, which was the head of defence intelligence.
Yeah.
And I was the lead for worldwide improvised explosive device intelligence. So I had a small team, multinational team, and we would look at all of the terrorist use of improvised explosive devices around the world and travel out to certain places, debrief them. And we became, pretty experts at what we were doing. And I'd also helped the Met Police and the other police forces when I was in the army to devise the procedures for dealing with a suicide bomber, should we ever have that when we, in the UK. And when 7/7 kicked off, I was with my team just down by Embankment Tube Station. We used to go and have a coffee down there every whatever day of the week it was. And I remember all our phones had gone off. We couldn't access the phones, and then everyone was sort of rushing around doing the same thing, trying to get their phones to work. So we went back to the office thinking something was wrong. And then, of course, we got the information from Sky News, as any decent intelligence organisation does. And I was told, go over to Cobra. You're going to be our subject matter expert on suicide terrorism. And it was fascinating going in there, actually, because there's a guy called Colonel Richard Kemp, who I'd worked with in the army. When I walked in there, actually, I was expecting Cobra to be this, like something off a movie set, like the Situations room at the that you see at the White House.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a room with a big long table, and all the members of the emergency cabinet sit around it. And then there's a corridor, and across the corridor, another tiny little room with 6 people in it. And when the Prime Minister or whoever asks a question, whichever minister doesn't know the answer, he then sends a quick message across to the person across the corridor. They then basically give the answer. Then he comes back sounding all informed. But we had one of the G8, G10, whatever it was, summits going on at the time. So a lot of stand-ins were basically taking responsibility and taking actions. And this guy, Colonel Kemp, I walked in there. I'd worked with him before. And this office of 6 suddenly became an office of about 20 people. There was MI5, there was MI6, there was police in there. It was very frenetic. Nobody knew what was going on. And the first thing he said was, Chris Hunter, I thought you'd be dead or in prison by now. And that was a nice break, There was a few expletives thrown in as well, but I won't use those now. And then as the day unfolded, I remember sitting around a table and there was senior people from MI5, MI6. And the way it worked, you'd go into the Cobra room, all of the intelligence guys would sit around and have the conversation. You'd come out, and then all the ministers would come in, and they'd basically have their conversation. And we were all there about 45, 50 minutes into it. 3 of the suicide bombings had happened at the same time, and then the 4th one had just occurred. And there's all these very, very informed senior people from the intelligence establishment. And then there was me, basically nobody knew who I was. And I said, I think this is Al-Qaeda. And literally, I could have just thrown a hand grenade in the room or something. And I remember this lady from one of the intelligence agencies saying, sorry, who are you and what qualifies you to come out with something so ridiculous? And I gave the reasons why. And then Colonel Kemp said, by the way, this is Chris Hunter. He's done X, Y, Z. He's done the procedures with the police. He's our expert. And basically sort of put her back in her box. Right. And then for the rest of the time, he just got everybody in there to work together. We would write an assessment for the Prime Minister, and then the decisions would be made basically and come down from him. And everybody had a chance to contribute to that. So he would say, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And people had different opinions, but he would put them all in there, as decision points and conversation pieces, and then everything would go. So he brought everybody together in that environment. And basically, nobody knew each other. Nobody knew what was happening. All our loved ones were in London or, somewhere where we were worried about them. We didn't know where they were in some cases, and just basically calmed down the entire environment and brought out the best in all of us, actually, so on a personal level, that was probably one of the most remarkable experiences.
That's a really interesting example, Chris, because some of us have all got our own paradigms of what it's like in the military, right? And one of the phrases that Neil and I see in leadership is a smart leader makes sure he recruits people who are smarter than him or her, right? But is that true then? For what you've just described there, that sounds like it's true for that situation. But my paradigm is that the leader in the military is the smarter person. Am I lost in there somewhere?
I think sometimes it's a bit of both, Albert, to be honest with you. I think, there are many organisations where the leader quite often is surrounded by very, very smart people. I would say our government, there's a lot of very, very smart people. Prime Minister's clearly a smart person, but so are the advisors and ministers as well. When you're in the military, it depends on what unit you're in, at any given time, I suppose. But I think if I was to sort of, encapsulate or define what I think military leadership's all about, I think it's probably the ability to, I don't know, maybe inspire others to achieve the otherwise unachievable in any given situation. That doesn't mean they wouldn't achieve something, but I think a military leader inspires them to achieve the optimum results.
Okay.
And that can be with a group of smart guys. It could be with a group of, not so smart guys, or capable, not so capable, whatever that might be. But I think, a military leader, they're more than just a manager, certainly. And we all hear that term management and leadership all the time, don't we? But I think maybe the one thing that sort of, is very unique to the military environment, you've got to basically get people, as Montgomery said, to do that which they wouldn't ordinarily do. Yeah. So achieve what they wouldn't ordinarily achieve, I would say.
And actually, that's true in business as well.
Yeah.
That phrase, inspire others to achieve the otherwise unachievable, is very similar, but you're just not putting lives on the line in the same way that you are in the military. Which leads me on to the next question I'd like to ask you, because in any leadership role, and you mentioned courage earlier, and quite often courage in business or in leadership roles that are not in an environment where your life's under threat. When you're in a busy environment, when you're under pressure from your boss or you're under pressure from customers, sometimes that courage of leadership crumbles, and blame game starts, and you start thrashing out. And what advice would you have for the leaders listening to this on the best way to lead and keep your courage going when you're under pressure?
You've just put me under pressure now. I think I'll put my money where my mouth is. I always talk about overcoming fear and breaking down the problem. So I'll break down the problem there, if you like.
Okay.
Overcoming that pressure. Basically, we're talking about fear of the unknown. Okay. And in my experience, there are two types of fear. There's the fear that comes from, a fear of danger, and danger is very much real. It's something tangible. Fear is just an emotion. Okay. So it could be something like fear of, I'm going to be involved in a car crash right now. There's a load of nasties over there with lots of guns, and they're about to brass me up and end my life and that of my team, in the environments that I often find myself. That's that sort of fear that's very much associated with danger, with harm, if you like.
Yeah.
The other type of fear I see a lot, and I know you guys would have seen it all the time too, and your viewers as well, it's that fear of failure and fear of ridicule.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because in both environments, actually, or both types of fear, I would say the way to overcome them are the same. But just to sort of talk a little bit more about that fear of failure, fear of ridicule, my experiences in the military, and then since on the public speaking circuit, I've been honoured to work with some exceptionally talented people, people with 40-pound brains, men and women that are just absolute super achievers, alpha males and females. And you sort of look at them and, I find myself constantly in awe of them. And then suddenly, I'll see them years later and find that they've just disappeared off the radar or something, or, they've made a mistake and it's been their undoing. And it's because of this fear of failure and the fear of ridicule. And it's such a shame because it's absolutely unnecessary, And I think most importantly, have another plan. I talked about plan and rehearsals earlier on. we always used to say, if plan A fails, remember there's another 25 letters in the alphabet. Always have a plan B. I think whether it's that physical fear or that sort of, fear of failure, the first thing you've got to do is accept there's an issue, identify what that issue is. What is it? Am I actually scared of being ridiculed here? And actually then break it down. Has anyone really genuinely got the time to be bothered about how I feel? Most people in that environment are way too busy focusing on their own areas of responsibility or concerned that somebody's going to ridicule them. It's something that's sort of it's almost unique to us as individuals, but we see it as something much bigger than it actually is. It's absolutely unnecessary. I think you've got to rationalize it. You've got to break it down and try and put it into compartmentalize it almost before you then go to deal with it. In the same way, like, a ship, a cargo vessel has all these different sort of bulkhead doors so that if there's a leak, it can isolate and contain it. It can send somebody to deal with that. What it doesn't do is sink the whole ship and the whole thing goes down quickly. I think that's really, really important. And I talked about that knowledge and that learning. I think learning something to fluency, if you can do, as a leader, you can't always learn everything. You can't be an expert in every single discipline. That's why, as I said, you surround yourself with the smart people, with the advisors and so on and so forth, and you listen to and you take that advice. And finally, I'd say breathe. And I'll put this into context if I've got time and if you're,
Yeah, sure.
Because like I say, I Forrest Gumped my way through my career. But I was experienced. I enjoyed what I did. I was passionate about it. I loved being a soldier and a bomb disposal operator and an officer. In Iraq in 2004, that was one of those sort of tours for me where all of those things were tested in the extreme. So it was a very sort of a pivotal part of my life, if you like. But there was one evening in particular, May the 5th, 2004. We were in fact, I've just made up the date there. May the 8th, 2004. And we were out on the ground in Basra in southern Iraq, dealing with improvised explosive devices. We'd done a bomb in the morning, my team and I, a bomb about lunchtime-ish, and then another device in the evening as well. And the robot broke down, so we had to take it to be repaired. Okay. And then we'd been out all day long, and then we were making our way back to our accommodation, our camp, which was in one of Saddam's old palaces, as it happened. And we were driving back about 11 o'clock at night. And as we were driving through one of the areas in the southern part of the city, we were ambushed. And an ambush is absolutely terrifying. It's designed to kill everybody within the target area. And there was 8 of us in unarmored vehicles. We were effectively the humanitarian arm of the military, if you like. We were people that were there to try and save lives. We weren't really, lean, mean fighting machines, heartbreakers, life takers. We were there to save lives. And we were all trained as soldiers. We were all capable. And I'd certainly spent time with the special forces. So, knew my way around a weapon system and a rifle. But it was the first time I'd ever actually had to, engage with the enemy at close quarters. And interestingly, when you're ambushed, like I say, it's designed to kill everybody. And as the bullets started, coming through the vehicle, I remember one went through the side of my helmet. There were grenades exploding all around us. A grenade exploded at the side of the vehicle, and some fragmentation went into my number 2, who was driving, into his shoulder. He was driving one-handed like this, and I thought, how cool is he? just driving like that in the middle of an ambush. When it all happened and kicked off, all of us froze. And I was an experienced officer by this point, but I had always expect myself to sort of, show some sort of Churchillian leadership in this sort of environment. But instead, I completely froze. And I couldn't understand why. I thought I was a coward or something like that. But when we sort of discussed it all afterwards and spoke with the psychiatrist and the specialists who sort of, debrief all the soldiers that get involved in this sort of environment and survive, they said, we go through exactly the same sort of process. And effectively, our limbic system, our muscle memory, it's where we train, where we learn to fluency. Everything is stored in there. Our normal day-to-day process in the near frontal cortex, the front part of our brain, is where we sort of, common sense, judgment, on the hoof decision-making, if you like, normal conversations. And when we're under extreme pressure, the there's a lack of oxygen, a lack of neurosignals flowing to the near frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex. So we can't function as normal. All we can do is draw upon the limbic system, the muscle memory. So if you haven't trained and practiced and rehearsed something before, and you're under extreme pressure, then you're going to actually freeze. And it's something that everybody will do if you haven't done that before. So what you've got to remember is that, A, that's that is a symptom of it. B, as long as you don't get killed, then actually, it will pass and you'll be able to function normally again as the oxygen starts to flow normally again and the neurosignals flow to the front part of your brain. And C, if you actually learn something, if you plan something, if you go through all of the eventualities, if you, can ideally do it to fluency, if it's stored in your muscle memory, then when suddenly something comes out of the blue, hopefully it won't be as life-endangering as an ambush, but something that just basically sets you off kilter. As long as you've planned it, you thought about it before, it doesn't catch you necessarily off guard completely, then you've got something to draw upon when you're under extreme pressure. Yeah. So I would say, that's a really, really good way. And hopefully that's a sort of, contextualizes all those sort of points I've discussed there as well.
Yeah. And they're absolutely paralleled to industry and people we could be talking on here who are in commercial roles. Absolutely parallel to that, right? Whether you're presenting to the board or whether you're getting ready for a key sales meeting to make sure you're going to win that deal, all of these things are exactly the same. It's just a different fear, right?
Exactly. And context, yeah.
It's in context,
environment, different landscape.
But it's a good point, though, about rehearsing, practicing, eventualities and breathing.
Yeah. I have to tell you, Chris, so for those that don't know, it's the first time I've spoken to Chris physically, right? We've communicated online, and it's a very strange thing perhaps for me to say, but if I look at what you've done and the effect you've had on people's lives and the world in general, I mean that genuinely, you come across with a lot of humanity and humility. You really do, right? You said right up front, when I talk about war, don't ever forget this is people's lives, right? So you don't glamorize it in any way, right? And you're absolutely clear on that. But one of the things we've been talking about recently is about how being human is a key part of being a good leader, right? What do you feel about that?
I just think, when I talked about communication being really important, I mentioned emotional intelligence. And I think being human is, do you know what? It's the most important part of being a person. That sounds like, stating the obvious. Yeah. But what I mean is, having empathy, having understanding, having compassion. And in war zones, I've been unlucky enough and lucky enough in equal measure to see the best and the worst of human nature, because war brings out the very best in people and it brings out the very worst in people. And I've been to a lot of war zones in my life, but I can honestly say with my hand on my heart that in my experience, people are fundamentally good.
Yeah.
What you tend to see is you see the better being brought out in people rather than the worst in people, even though you do see both, Yeah. So I think, to be a leader, I don't think you would be a leader if you didn't possess humility and compassion and understanding. And I think if you were, and you were, morally defunct of those qualities, I don't think you'd last for very long.
Yeah.
I think it's a passing fad.
Yeah, you'd be surprised actually. In some of the businesses Albert and I have worked in, there are people who survived quite a long way up the chain. But we won't dwell on that.
Yeah, but what that says is, what carnage have they left in their wake, right? Yeah. That's the difference, right? So they might be labelled as a leader, but that's a different thing.
And what could they have achieved if they'd actually had compassion?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or what could have their people have achieved, if they'd had that compassion and humility?
Yeah.
So I think Albert, we should move on to the quick fire questions now.
I think we should.
Let Chris kind of relax a little bit and then we'll wrap up. So go on, I'll let you shoot first.
So you've got a lot of experience, Chris, but as a leadership role model, is there anyone you would highlight as a leadership role model that's affected your thinking and life?
I think Sir Ranulph Fiennes, in terms of what he's achieved as an explorer and as a writer, and Al Gore, the man who didn't make president, I was his bodyguard once, and one of the most. I met him when he was really, really tired. He had no sleep for a few days. I looked after him for 48 hours non-stop, and one of the most inspiring people I've ever met.
Yeah, fantastic.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So, and if you were going to gift a leadership book, other than one of your books, obviously, but if you were going to gift a book about leadership to a leader, what book would you gift?
I would say there's a new book out written by the Commandant of Sandhurst called Stand Up Straight. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty good book. And I would say any of the books by Ranulph Fiennes.
Yeah.
Okay. So something else for people to try and remember you and what we've done here today. Have you got a quote or saying of any substance around leadership that you would want to leave with people here today?
Let me have a think about that. I guess what I would say is, the best quote. Just remember when you're in times of difficulty, when you're in times of extreme stress, extreme pressure, the chips are down and it seems like there's no way out. Just remember that this too will pass. Everything good in your life, everything bad in your life at any given point in time is just a given point in time. So it'll always get better, it'll always get worse, but just remember, enjoy every minute of it when it's good, and just remember it's going to pass when it's bad. This too will pass.
Brilliant.
Great piece. Thank you.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up, actually. So, Chris, that's inspiring. I knew you would be in these conversations. Great stories, great knowledge, and great linkage between what you've done and what other leaders can take away from this. Any final words you just want to say before we let Albert wrap up?
Just, thank you so much for having me on. I know you've had some great people on this show, and I genuinely don't feel worthy. The Forrest Gump comment wasn't me being modest. I have to pinch myself. I do have a normal life with an extraordinary job, perhaps, but I'm very, very grateful. And, thank you all. And I hope your viewers are able to take something away from it that's beneficial. Thank you.
Thanks.
Chris, really inspirational. Fantastic to have had you here. And look, we could have spent a lot more time, but thank you very much for what you shared with the audience. Lots of parallels for people to take away in leadership. And it sounds like you've had a fascinating start to your life and plenty more to go. So fantastic. To our audience, thank you very much for listening. Please let us have your likes, your comments, your feedback, your subscriptions. And let us know anything else that you'd like us to talk about. But really enjoying what we're doing for you here, guys. Hope we've added value, inspiring current leaders and aspiring.
So goodbye from the Leadership Detectives. Thanks, Chris. And we'll catch you on the next episode.
All the best. Cheers, guys. Take care.